Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at expansion and imperialism in our continuing study of world civilizations. Back in the 1800s, Henry M. Stanley wrote a book of his travels. He was a journalist. He entitled it Through the Dark Continent. And when he spoke of the Dark Continent, he was speaking of Africa. Dark, not because they didn't have electricity, although that was true too, still is in some cases, but it was dark because it had been unexplored, at least by Europeans. It was dark to Europeans. However, prior to Stanley's voyage, David Livingstone had been there earlier. He had been a Scottish Congregationalist, a Christian who had both theological as well as medical training, and he set out to be a missionary. He had originally wanted to go to China. That didn't work out for him, and instead now he turned his attention to Africa. Africa during this time was known for its slave trade, this going back many hundreds of years, and even though slavery was now illegal in many parts of the European world, slavery had not gone away in other places. It was his travels that are going to open the travel routes for European civilization. So he will be, in a sense, the first pioneer, the first explorer, not to go around Africa. People had been circumnavigating it for some time now. Areas along the coast had been colonized, and there was plenty of folks who had traveled to the coast. But as far as the interior, David Livingstone, in many ways, was going to be the first, not the first person, but the first European, because he's going to, he and Stanley will write about their travels. He travels across Africa, had a very limited accompaniment. Those who had undertaken such travels usually had a very big safari, all sorts of porters and helpers, and Livingstone, by contrast, traveled with just a handful of people. He is an advocate for the abolition of slavery, and he is speaking out in both letters and publications, but then he goes into the interior, and for many years he's not heard from again, because his focus was more on exploration. And the further time went, there was less and less focus on evangelism. I'm not saying he didn't do any, but throughout his entire travels and ministry, he saw very few people actually come to the Lord. And so more and more his emphasis was on exploration. One of the converts that he had was Chief Sekali, who made a profession of faith, but then had issues with polygamy. He had several wives, and Livingstone said, well, Christians can't have more than one wife, and so the good chief got rid of all but the youngest and prettiest. But then later on, when Livingstone went back, the chief had taken on another wife or so. So this issue of polygamy was continuous. Of course, remember that the African male population had been greatly decreased because of the slave trade. Here's a picture of, and this is a recent picture of Africa via satellite photo at night. Notice even today, in some respects, you can see it. I won't call it a dark continent, but the darker with regard to electricity and civilization. And I'm not saying there's no civilization there, but it's much more scattered. It's much more open, as compared. Notice Europe and even to the northeast, the Middle East. Here is a political cartoon. Notice you have Britain and Germany and Russia all playing grab bag, all seeking to see what portions of the undeveloped world that they can take and colonize. And this is going to be the history of that sort of colonization that takes place. Here's a map after the Berlin Conference of 1884. By this time, Africa, for the most part, you notice there's a couple of places that are in gray, those areas that are free, both Ethiopia in the east and Liberia in the west. But most of the rest of it had come under various European colonizations. England in particular, notice the British section is a long strip going from Egypt all the way to South Africa with a little bit of a break in between. and France had a large chunk in the north and in the west, um, and these countries had divided up the continent of Africa among themselves. Of particular note is the Congo region. Leopold II of Belgium, who claimed what he called the Congo Free State. It wasn't free to themselves. It was free to him because he wasn't paying anybody for it. And he takes this not just as a possession of Belgium, but as his own personal possession. And so these treaties had been established by, we mentioned Stanley earlier, these treaties had been established by Stanley, but now they came to take on a new face. And any undeveloped land became the personal property of the king. Natives were mandated to collect rubber, and if they did not collect, or if they did not collect enough, very severe penalties. And when I say severe, mutilations, hands that would be cut off. Notice these pictures, both women and children who would be maimed and tortured because they hadn't collected enough for the emperor. There's another picture that just focuses upon hands and feet that had been cut off only to satisfy this Belgian emperor's greed. During his time, the population of the Congo decreases by half through executions, through starvation. After all, if their hands and feet have been cut off, they're going to be in no shape to till their land, to grow their food, by disease, because that weakened immune systems. Joseph Conrad writes a novel depicting some of the atrocities, comes out in 1902, entitled The Heart of Darkness, and it serves, and other things serve, to bring these excesses to light. And the rest of Europe begins to take a very dim view on the actions of Leopold. There has been a African Renaissance monument. We go to the very dark to the very light in Senegal, Africa. It was completed in 2010. It stands 160 feet high as a monument to the free spirit of the African nations, celebrating their 50th anniversary, in this case of freedom from France. Now, I want to turn our attention from Africa over to Japan. In 1853, Admiral Perry of the United States sails into Tokyo with his warships, and under the threat of bombardment, because Japan had had a policy of not allowing anybody from outside of Japan entrance to their country. And so he forced the ports to become open to trade. That brought about civil unrest in Japan. But eventually, after the dust settled, Japan embarked upon a policy of modernization. This was seen in the advent of railroads and technology, of medicine, of Western dress. This is a picture of the Emperor of Japan, and notice he's not wearing traditional Japanese clothing, but instead has arrayed himself in the dress and uniform of a European. Their military began to modernize also and to expand. And this will bring about a period of colonization, not other countries colonizing Japan, but rather Japan saying, look, we're trying to follow in the footsteps of Europeans, and they're colonizing other areas. We need to adopt that policy as well. And so Japan will go out and colonize Korea, and also they'll enter into an issue with Taiwan when one of their ships is shipwrecked and the people that were on the ship aren't treated nicely. Japan goes down and takes Taiwan as its own possession. And so this period of colonization will continue to increase into the 20th century. And of course, eventually, Japan is going to be one of the belligerents in World War II. Now I want to turn our attention to the United States. And here on this map, notice we see the territorial acquisitions. First, you'd have the 13 states, but then that eventually moved further and further westward, all the way to the Mississippi River. And then in 1803, at the behest of Thomas Jefferson, the United States purchases from France what's called the Louisiana Purchase. Now, that was very big of the French, but remember that there were Indians living there. They weren't getting given any of those monies, the Native Americans. And so, notice these lands are being taken from other European countries without a lot of regard to the Native Americans that were already there. And so this is perhaps colonialism at its worst. Texas, and then both Texas and Mexico. And when I say Mexico, notice those Mexican possessions, which originally went up into what today is California, Nevada, and Utah. Those were all Mexican possessions, and they were obtained from Mexico in the 1840s. And finally, in 1846, the Oregon territories were granted because those had been settled, or at least claimed, by Great Britain, and now these became a part of United States territories as well. And so it was one thing to claim the territories, it was another thing to go and settle there, and this westward movement now began with a vengeance in the 1800s. It did not stop there. Notice this is a photograph, not a painting or a drawing. My own uncle was actually born in a covered wagon. On his way, in their case, they were going from Kansas down to Texas. And he took great delight in recounting that his birth had taken place. My father was already alive, was a young boy in that same wagon as they were traveling from one area to another. Eventually, the covered wagons were replaced by railroads, and it was in 1869 that the first transatlantic railroad met. Those tracks were coming both from the east and from the west, and they finally met, and the nation had now been joined by railroad.